February 14th, 1886. Timber Ridge, Montana Territory. The temperature sits at -37 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside most cabins, families huddle within 3 feet of their fireplaces, wrapped in every blanket they own. Children sleep in their coats. Floors remain so cold that ice forms on the inside of the walls. But in one cabin at the edge of the settlement, something impossible is happening. 3 children, ages 4, 6, and 8, are playing barefoot on the floor. Not huddled by the fire, not shivering under quilts. Barefoot, comfortable, laughing. The neighbors called it insane. The town carpenter said it would kill her family. The local pastor suggested she was courting disaster with foolish pride. She built a fireplace underground, beneath her cabin, in a stone-lined basement that everyone said would fill with smoke, collapse the floor, or burn the house to cinders. What did Sarah Macklin understand about heat that an entire settlement of experienced builders had missed? If you want to see how a widowed mother with 3 children outsmarted winter itself, hit that subscribe button, because today you're getting a lesson in thermal engineering that builders are rediscovering 140 years later. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and let's get into this. Sarah Macklin had been a widow for 7 months when the first real cold arrived. Her husband, a timber hauler, had been crushed by a rolling log in May of 1885. He left her with 3 children, a half-finished cabin, and $42 in coin. No relatives within 300 miles. No trade except what she'd learned watching her father build spring houses back in Pennsylvania. The cabin he'd started sat on a limestone outcrop. He'd dug a root cellar into the stone, 8 feet deep, 10 feet square, lined with fitted limestone blocks he'd quarried from the ridge. Good stonework. Dry. Cool in summer. The problem was the cabin above it. He'd framed the floor with pine joists, laid planks, chinked the gaps. Standard frontier construction. But he died before finishing the chimney. The fireplace was nothing but a crude box of fieldstone against the north wall. No proper firebox, no throat, no damping system. October came. The children started waking with frost on their blankets. Sarah tried the conventional solution first. She hired a mason from the settlement, a man named Horace Brill who'd built 14 chimneys in the valley. He quoted her $18 for a proper stone chimney with a damper and clean-out. She had $9 left after buying winter provisions. Brill shrugged. "Then you'll freeze, ma'am. Can't build half a chimney." The problem wasn't just money. It was physics. Every night, heat from the crude fireplace rose straight through the gaps in her floorboards. The floor itself stayed ice-cold. The children slept in a loft where it was even colder, heat rising away from their bodies, cold air sinking from the rafters onto their faces. She'd wake at 2 a.m. to feed the fire. By 5 a.m., it was cold again. She was burning through a week's worth of wood every 4 days. November 8th, 1885. First heavy snow. Her youngest, Timothy, developed a cough that wouldn't quit. The older 2, Clara and William, had chilblains on their feet from the cold floor. Sarah Macklin stood in that frigid cabin, looked at the trapdoor to the root cellar, and made a decision that would get her called insane. If heat rises, and her floor was the coldest part of the cabin, why was she putting the fire above the floor? The root cellar was stone. Stone holds heat. Her father had always said that. She spent 2 days pulling apart the fieldstone firebox upstairs. She hauled the stones down into the cellar. She built a new firebox against the east wall, crude but functional. She knocked a hole through the cabin's north wall, ran a tin stovepipe up the outside, anchored it with wire. The setup looked like something a child might draw. A fireplace underground. A chimney poking out the side of the cabin like a broken bone. Her neighbor, a man named Garrett Stills, came by on the 3rd day. Watched her wire the chimney to the wall. "Sarah," he said, not unkindly, "that's not a fireplace. That's a death trap." She wiped soot from her hands. "It draws. It'll fill your house with smoke. That cellar will turn into an oven, crack your floor joists, burn the whole structure down." "It draws," she said again. Garrett shook his head. "You're heating a hole in the ground while your children freeze upstairs. You know that, right?" She didn't know that. According to every rule of common sense, It made no sense. But she also knew that the limestone floor of the cabin, 12 inches of stone sitting directly above the cellar, was warming up for the first time since her husband died. The physics were simple, even if no one in Timber Ridge understood them yet. Sarah had accidentally built a radiant floor heating system. Here's how it worked. The fireplace in the cellar, 8 feet below the cabin floor, burned wood in a firebox made of limestone blocks. Those blocks absorbed heat. Slowly. Limestone has high thermal mass, meaning it takes a long time to heat up, but once warm, it takes even longer to cool down. The heat radiated in every direction, up into the stone floor, into the stone walls of the cellar, even into the earth around the foundation. The cabin floor itself was 12 inches of fitted limestone slabs, the same stone her husband had quarried for the root cellar. Sarah had insisted on stone instead of wood because it was cheaper and didn't rot. Now, that stone was absorbing heat from below. A wood floor would have insulated the cabin from the cellar. Stone conducted the heat upward. Within 3 hours of lighting the fire, the floor temperature rose from 34 degrees Fahrenheit to 61 degrees Fahrenheit. By hour 6, it stabilized at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The warmth radiated upward into the cabin, not the sharp directional heat of a fireplace where one side of your body roasts and the other freezes. This was even, gentle, rising from below like a warm spring. The chimney, a straight tin pipe running up the outside of the cabin, created a draft. Smoke pulled cleanly out of the cellar. No backdraft. No creosote building up inside the living space. There was one more benefit Sarah hadn't anticipated. The cellar stayed warm. Consistently warm. She could store potatoes, carrots, apples down there without them freezing. The stone walls prevented moisture from condensing. Her root vegetables lasted through February without sprouting or rotting, something that had never happened in a conventional root cellar where temperatures swung wildly. But to everyone watching from outside, it looked insane. The chimney poked out the side of the cabin like a mistake. There was no fireplace inside the main room. No hearth, no mantle, no visible flame. Just a warm floor and a trapdoor that led to a basement full of fire. Garrett Stills told Horace Brill, the mason. Brill told the pastor. The pastor mentioned it in passing to the families who attended Sunday service at the schoolhouse. By late November, 17 people had opinions about Sarah Macklin's underground fire. Horace Brill was the most vocal. She's put a furnace under a wooden structure, he said. Those joists will dry out, crack, and drop the whole cabin into the cellar. If the smoke doesn't kill them first. A trapper named Silas Oak had a different concern. Fire belongs where you can see it. You can't control what you can't see. Even the settlement's doctor, a man named Whitmore who'd studied in Philadelphia, weighed in. Enclosed fires produce coal gas. If that cellar isn't vented properly, those children will suffocate in their sleep. No one asked Sarah how it was working. They just watched, waited, expected the worst. The floor stayed warm. The children stopped coughing. Sarah burned half the wood she'd burned in October. Still, the consensus held. It was a fool's contraption. Dangerous. Unsustainable. A matter of time before disaster struck. Then December came, and winter stopped being theoretical. The coldest part of frontier life wasn't the temperature. It was the judgment. Sarah Macklin felt it every time she walked to the settlement's general store. Conversation stopped. Women looked away. Men watched with the kind of pity reserved for someone making a slow, visible mistake. Horace Brill made sure everyone knew his position. "I've built chimneys from Minnesota to Oregon," he said one afternoon, loud enough for the whole store to hear. "And I've never seen a woman try to heat a house from underneath. You know why? Because it doesn't work." He was leaning against the counter, surrounded by 4 other men who nodded along. "She's burning good firewood to warm a cellar," Brill continued. "Meanwhile, her children are up top, freezing. That heat doesn't rise through stone. It dissipates into the ground. She'd be better off burning it in the yard." Sarah was standing 6 feet away, buying cornmeal. She didn't turn around. Brill kept going. "I give it until January. Either the floor cracks, or she runs out of wood, or, God forbid, one of those children goes down there and gets burned. Then she'll come asking for help, and I'll build her a proper chimney. for $20. One of the men, Garrett Stills, shifted uncomfortably. The floor does seem warm when you walk in, Horace. Brill waved him off. Warm now. Wait until the real cold hits. Stone doesn't hold heat the way people think it does. It pulls heat out of the air. That cabin will be colder than anyone's by February. The storekeeper, a man named Pruitt, tried to soften the moment. Maybe she's just trying to make do, Horace. She doesn't have the money for a regular chimney. Then she should have asked the church for help, Brill said, instead of putting her children at risk with some Pennsylvania hillbilly nonsense. Sarah paid for her cornmeal. Walked out. She didn't argue. Didn't defend herself. What was the point? But the words followed her home. Hillbilly nonsense. Doesn't work. Putting her children at risk. The children, meanwhile, were thriving. Timothy's cough was gone. Clara and William no longer woke with numb feet. They played on the warm stone floor in the mornings, something they'd never been able to do in October. Sarah burned 4 logs a day. Her neighbors burned 8. But none of that mattered to the settlement. What mattered was that it looked wrong. A chimney on the side of cabin. No visible fire inside. A woman doing something no man in the valley had tried. By mid-December, even the pastor had gotten involved. Reverend Calhoun stopped by on a Sunday afternoon, ostensibly to check on the family. He stood in the doorway, hat in hand, and looked around the room. "It's warm in here," he said, surprised. "Yes," Sarah said. "Where's the fire?" She gestured to the trapdoor. "Downstairs." Calhoun frowned. "You're heating from the cellar?" "Yes." He looked at the children, playing near the far wall. They were barefoot. He looked back at Sarah. "Mrs. Macklin," he said carefully, "I don't want to overstep, but people are concerned. A fire in an enclosed space, especially underground, can produce fumes. Dangerous fumes. The chimney draws clean," Sarah said. "I'm sure it does now. But in January, when the real cold comes, that draw might fail. Smoke might back up. I've seen it happen." "Have you seen it happen with a fire below a stone floor?" Calhoun hesitated. "No, but I haven't seen anyone try it, either. There's usually a reason for that." Sarah said nothing. The Reverend put his hat back on. "I'll pray for you and the children. I hope you'll reconsider before the deep cold sets in." He left. Sarah closed the door. That night, she stood at the trapdoor and looked down at the fireplace. The flames licked quietly against the limestone. The air smelled like oak smoke and warm stone. It was working. She knew it was working, but knowing didn't stop the doubt from creeping in. What if Brill was right? What if the real cold broke the system? What if the floor cracked, or the chimney failed, or the children got hurt because she'd been too stubborn to do things the normal way? She fed 2 more logs into the fire, closed the trapdoor. Upstairs, the floor radiated a gentle, steady warmth. December rolled on, and then the cold arrived. January 9th, 1886. The temperature dropped to -12 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. By morning, it was -18 degrees Fahrenheit. By noon, -23 degrees Fahrenheit. The sky was the color of old iron. No clouds, just a thin, brutal cold that came down from Canada and settled over Montana territory like a hand pressing down on glass. People in Timber Ridge burned through a week's worth of firewood in 2 days. Chimneys that had worked fine in December started drafting poorly. Smoke backed into cabins. Families hung blankets over doorways, stuffed rags into gaps in the walls, slept in their coats. Horace Brill's own chimney, a structure he'd built with pride, developed a crack in the firebox. Heat escaped through the stonework instead of radiating into the room. He burned twice the wood and got half the warmth. Garrett Still's cabin had a wood floor. Heat from his fireplace rose to the ceiling and disappeared into the rafters. His children slept with heated stones wrapped in cloth, stones that went cold within 2 hours. By January 12th, the temperature hit -31 degrees Fahrenheit. Timber Ridge had seen cold before, but not like this. Not this sustained. Not this windless and dead. Firewood became currency. Families rationed logs like gold. Some began burning furniture, chairs first, then bed frames, then anything that wasn't load-bearing. On January 14th, a family 3 miles south ran out of wood entirely. The father walked to the settlement in -28 degrees Fahrenheit cold, hands wrapped in burlap, to beg for help. Reverend Calhoun organized a collection. Families gave what they could spare, which wasn't much. The cold didn't care about charity. It pressed down. Constant. Unforgiving. Garrett Stills walked past Sarah Macklin's cabin on the morning of January 16th. He'd been checking his trap line. Foolish in this cold, but he needed pelts to trade for food. He saw smoke rising from the side chimney. Thin. Steady. He stopped. The snow around the cabin had melted in a 3-foot radius from the foundation. Everywhere else in the settlement, snow was piled against cabin walls, frozen solid. Here it was gone. He walked closer, put his hand near the base of the cabin wall. Warm. Not hot. Not burning. Just warm. He knocked on the door. Sarah answered. She was wearing a wool dress. No coat. No shawl. Behind her, the children were sitting on the floor, playing with carved wooden animals. Barefoot. Garrett stared. Are you all right? Sarah asked. He blinked. It's minus 34 degrees outside. I know. Your children, they're not wearing shoes. Sarah glanced back at them. The floor's warm. Garrett looked past her into the cabin. No fireplace on the wall. No hearth. Just a warm, even space that felt impossibly comfortable. How much wood are you burning? He asked. 4 logs a day. Sometimes 3. He was burning 9, and his cabin was still cold. Can I? He hesitated. Can I see the cellar? Sarah stepped aside. Garrett walked to the trapdoor, lifted it. Warm air rose into his face. Not smoke, not fumes, just clean, dry warmth. Below, the fireplace burned quietly against the east wall. The limestone blocks glowed dull orange. The stone floor radiated heat like a stove. He knelt, put his hand on the floor of the cabin. 68 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe 70 degrees Fahrenheit. His own cabin, with a roaring fire 6 feet away, had a floor temperature of 41 degrees Fahrenheit. How long does the heat last? He asked. After the fire dies, the floor stays warm for about 10 hours, Sarah said. Sometimes 12. Garrett closed the trapdoor. Stood. He looked at Sarah, then at the children, then back at Sarah. Horace Brill said this wouldn't work. I know. He said the floor would crack. It hasn't. He said you'd freeze. Sarah smiled faintly. We haven't. Garrett walked to the door. Stopped. Turned back. Can I bring my wife by tomorrow? She won't believe this. January 17th, 1886. Minus 37 degrees Fahrenheit. The coldest temperature Timber Ridge had ever recorded. Garrett Stills brought his wife and to Sarah Macklin's cabin just after dawn, and was skeptical. Garrett had tried to explain the underground fireplace, but it sounded like a fever dream. There's no fire inside the cabin, and asked as they walked through knee-deep snow. Not what you'd expect it, Garrett said. They knocked. Sarah answered, holding a cup of coffee. No coat, no blanket around her shoulders, and stepped inside. The warmth hit her like stepping into a different season. She looked down. The stone floor radiated heat through her boots. She looked up. No fireplace. No stove. Just 3 children playing near the far wall, barefoot, in cotton shirts, laughing. Ow! And started. Sarah pointed to the trapdoor. The fire's below, and walked over. Garrett lifted the door. The cellar glowed. The limestone walls absorbed and reflected heat like the inside of a bread oven. The firebox burned steadily, not roaring, not struggling, just a controlled, even flame that fed into a stone structure designed to hold warmth. And knelt, touched the floor. It's warmer than my kitchen floor in July, she whispered. Sarah handed her a cup of coffee. I can brew more if you'd like. By midday, for more families had stopped by. Word spread faster than fire. Horace Brill showed up at 2 p.m. alone. He didn't knock, just stood in the doorway looking. Sarah invited him in. He walked slowly across the floor, felt the warmth through his boots, looked at the children, healthy, comfortable, barefoot. How much wood today? He asked quietly. 3 logs so far, Sarah said. Brill had burned 11 by noon. He walked to the trapdoor. Sarah opened it without being asked. Brill stared down into the cellar for a long time. The stone's holding the heat, he said finally. Yes. And the floor's conducting it upward. Yes. He closed the trapdoor. Stood. I was wrong, he said. It wasn't an apology, but it was as close as Horace Brill got. By evening, Reverend Calhoun arrived. He'd heard the reports and didn't believe them. He brought a thermometer, a mercury instrument he'd ordered from Chicago for weather tracking. He placed it on the floor near the center of the cabin. 72 degrees Fahrenheit. He moved it to the corner farthest from the trapdoor. 68 degrees Fahrenheit. He placed it on the sleeping loft where the children slept. 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Then he walked outside and measured the exterior temperature. Minus 37 degrees Fahrenheit. He came back inside, looked at Sarah. "Mrs. Macklin," he said slowly, "you've heated this cabin to 72 degrees with a fire burning 8 feet below the floor in the coldest weather this territory has ever seen." "Yes," Sarah said, "and you're using less wood than anyone in the settlement." "Yes." Calhoun set the thermometer down. "I owe you an apology. I thought you were risking your children's lives. I see now that you've saved them." That night, the temperature dropped to minus 39 degrees Fahrenheit. Sarah burned 2 logs before bed. The floor held its heat until morning. In Garrett Still's cabin, the fire went out at 3 a.m. His children woke shivering. In Horace Brill's cabin, the cracked firebox leaked heat into the walls. He burned through his weekly ration in 4 days. Across Timber Ridge, families huddled, burned furniture, prayed for the cold to break. In Sarah Macklin's cabin, 3 children slept soundly in a loft warmed by stone that had been absorbing heat for 10 hours. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just change Sarah's life. It changed how an entire region built homes. Hit that like button if you're seeing the brilliance of this system, and drop a comment telling me, have you ever experienced cold like this? What's the coldest winter you've survived? Spring came late to Montana Territory in 1886. The snow didn't fully melt until mid-April. By then, Sarah Macklin's cabin had become something of a pilgrimage site. 19 families had visited during the worst of the cold. Most came skeptical. All left convinced. Horace Brill was the first to adapt the design. He came back to Sarah's cabin in early February, after the brutal cold had broken, and asked if he could sketch the cellar layout. Sarah handed him a pencil and let him measure. Brill spent 2 hours down there with a tape measure and notebook, documenting everything. The dimensions of the firebox, the thickness of the limestone walls, the height of the chimney, the spacing of the floor joists above. "I've been building chimneys for 15 years, he said when he climbed back up, "and I never thought to put the fire below the floor. It goes against everything I was taught." "What were you taught?" Sarah asked. "That heat rises, so the fire should be at the lowest point of the living space. That you need to see the fire to control it. That stone floors are cold." He shook his head. "I was taught wrong." By late March, Brill had built 3 basement hearths for families in the settlement. Each one followed Sarah's basic design: a stone-lined cellar, a firebox against the wall, an exterior chimney, and a limestone floor above. The results were consistent. Families reported 40 to 50% reductions in wood consumption. Floor temperatures stabilized between 65 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit. Children stopped getting sick from cold-related ailments. Root cellars stayed warm enough to prevent freezing without getting so warm that vegetables sprouted. Garrett Stills built his own version in April. He didn't have a root cellar, so he dug one, 8 feet deep, reinforced with river stone. His cabin sat on clay soil, not limestone bedrock, so he hauled flat stones from a quarry 12 miles away and laid them as a floor. It worked. His wife, Ann, told everyone who'd listen, "We slept through the night for the first time in 3 years. The children don't wake up cold. I don't wake up to feed the fire every 2 hours." Word spread beyond Timber Ridge. A trapper passing through in May stopped at the settlement, heard about the underground fire cabins, and sketched the concept in his journal. He carried that journal to Fort Benton, showed it to a builder there. The builder tried it. It worked. By the winter of 1887, 11 cabins within a 50-mile radius had incorporated some version of Sarah's design. Not all of them were identical. Some used sandstone instead of limestone. Some built the firebox in the center of the cellar instead of against a wall. Some added clay bricks to increase thermal mass. One family in the Madison Valley built a double cellar, 2 chambers with separate fireboxes that could be alternated to spread out the heat. The principle, though, remained the same: put the fire below the floor Use stone to absorb and radiate heat. Let the floor become the radiator. It wasn't called the Macklin method or the timber ridge system. Most people just referred to it as a basement hearth or stone floor heating. But everyone knew where it started. Sarah Macklin, a widowed mother with no formal training, had solved a problem that experienced builders had never thought to address. She didn't do it with blueprints or engineering degrees. She did it by observing what worked: her father's spring houses, the cool stone of the root cellar, the way heat moves through mass, and by being desperate enough to try something that looked insane. The technique became standard practice in parts of Montana and Wyoming by the 1890s. Homesteaders building cabins in cold climates would dig the cellar first, line it with stone, and install the firebox before framing the cabin above. Some innovations emerged organically. Builders started adding ventilation grates in the floor to allow warm air to rise more quickly. Others installed metal plates in the cellar ceiling to conduct heat more efficiently. A few experimental designs used water-filled copper pipes running through the cellar to create a crude hydronic heating system. By 1900, the practice had spread to parts of Idaho and North Dakota. A building manual published in Billings in 1903 included a section on subfloor radiant heating using masonry mass, a formal description of what Sarah had built by necessity. Horace Brill, to his credit, never took credit for the design. When people asked him about basement hearths, he always said the same thing: "A widow in Timber Ridge figured it out before I did. I just wrote it down." Sarah Macklin lived in that cabin until 1912. Her children grew up warm. Timothy became a stonemason, trained by Horace Brill. Clara married a homesteader and insisted on a basement hearth in her own cabin. William moved to Bozeman and worked as a surveyor, but he built his retirement home with the same system his mother had invented. Sarah never spoke publicly about the design. She didn't write articles or give lectures. When people asked her how she'd thought of it, she'd shrug and say, "I didn't have money for a proper chimney, so I worked with what I had." But the truth was deeper than that. She'd understood something fundamental: that the cold wasn't just a problem of insufficient heat, it was a problem of heat storage and distribution. A conventional fireplace produces intense heat in one direction and loses most of it up the chimney. The floor stays cold because heat rises away from it. Sarah's system reversed that. The fire heated stone, the stone held the heat, and the floor radiated it evenly across the entire living space. The thermal mass of the limestone acted like a battery, charging slowly, discharging slowly, maintaining temperature long after the fire died. It wasn't magic. It was physics. And it was exactly the kind of knowledge that gets dismissed as hillbilly nonsense until a crisis proves it works. The winter of 1886 taught Timber Ridge a lesson that most of us have forgotten. The best solutions don't always come from experts. Sometimes they come from people who can't afford to do things the right way, so they do things the way that works. Sarah Macklin didn't set out to revolutionize home heating. She set out to keep her children warm with the resources she had: a root cellar, some limestone, and a willingness to ignore people who said it couldn't be done. What looked insane in November proved brilliant by January. The underground fireplace wasn't a miracle. It was observation, necessity, and stone doing what stone does: holding heat. So here's the question for you. What part of Sarah's system could you use today? Could you add thermal mass to your home? Stone, brick, or water to hold heat longer? Could you rethink where your heat source sits and how it distributes? Could you look at an impossible problem and ask, what if the conventional method is wrong? The principles haven't changed. Heat still moves through mass. Stone still holds warmth. Radiant heating still works better than blasting hot air into a cold room. We've just gotten used to doing things the way everyone else does them. Sarah Macklin didn't have that luxury. And because of that, she built something smarter than what the experts recommended. Drop a comment and tell me, where are you watching from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever survived? Let's hear your stories. And if this made you rethink what's possible with simple materials and smart design, hit that subscribe button, because next week, we're diving into another insane frontier hack that turned out to be pure genius. Educational note: This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.